So good afternoon, good morning to everyone. I'm particularly happy to welcome you for this 8th and last webinar of our series on screens. Well, the basic idea of this series of webinar was to explore the topic of screens and digital mediascape from a variety of points of view. So we had great speakers from a variety of disciplines. We had philosophy, aesthetics, art history, media theory, film history, and film theory. And today we have Carolyn Christov-Bakargiev, director of the museum Castello di Rivoli, Turin, Italia, who will bring us to explore a further dimension of the digital world, namely what happens to museum in the digital age. But before give it to Carolyn, I would like to introduce her. Carolyn Christov-Bakargiev is a writer, an art historian, and a curator. As I said, she's the director of Castello di Rivoli Museo d'Arte Contemporanea and of Fondazione Francesco Federico Cerruti in Turin, Italy. She was the recipient in 2019 of the Audrey Irmas Award for Curatorial Excellence. She was Edith Krieger Wolf Distinguished Visiting Professor in Art Theory and Practice at Northwestern University from 2013 to 2019. She was the curator of the 16th Biennale of Sydney in 2008, the artistic director of Documenta in 2012, and of the 14th Istanbul Biennale in 2015. She has written over 20 books, including Arte Povera in 1999, and monographs on the work of many contemporary artists. I will name just a few: William Kentridge, Pierre Huyghe, Nalini Malani, Anna Bohiguian, Tirster Gates, Hito Steyer, Ed Atkins, Adrian Villarojas, and Mikel Rakovitz. As I said, today Carolyn will talk on screens, masks, art, and audience in praise of slow museums. So please, Carolyn, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Vittorio, and I'm very happy to be here with all of you and to take part in this extremely interesting conference that you've organized. So thank you to the University of Parma and everyone who has made this happen. The subject is so broad, screens, masks, art and audience in praise of slow museums. Almost sounds like a haiku. And I'm actually in the middle of trying to develop a concept for a museum, which I call slow museum, taken from, of course, the term slow food, which was coined here in Piemonte. And I'd like to spend, in honor of rootedness, 1 minute in Italian and then pick up the conversation, pick up the lecture again in English. Quindi io sono stata chiamata a partecipare a questa conferenza e vorrei introdurre alcune preoccupazioni legate al sovraccarico digitale, in cui l'esperienza virtuale, o piuttosto non direi virtuale, ma AK, at keyboard, sembra prendere sempre più il sopravvento, come se la scomparsa del pubblico, il pubblico proprio fisico dei musei e delle mostre, e le contraddizioni del narcisismo fossero collegate anche alla importanza della presenza corporea nell'esperienza delle opere d'arte in quello che si può chiamare ormai un regime epistemico digitale. basically, I'm going to introduce some preoccupations connected with the overload of digital experience in our screen-based world, or rather than screen-based, I would almost say our AK world, our at keyboard world, shifting a little bit the focus onto the experience of the body as a totality in a screen-based situation of a laptop or cell phones and so on, and the connection with the disappearance of the audience, the disappearance of the physical audience, and what might be, as our philosopher in residence, Leonardo Caffo, calls the disappearance of the audience that had already occurred long ago with the digital audience. And therefore think about, together with you also, a little bit about the contradictions and forms of narcissism that are developing today, narcissistic disorders, and speak about basically the experience of artworks in what we could call by now an epistemic digital regime, an epistemic digital order, Foucault would say. So museums are a very symbolic place for societies since they began in the late 1700s on the basis of the rendering public, of the encountering a public, which prior to that was aristocratic and private only, royal in many cases. And symbolic, it is a symbolic place where in the future, I think that we will be transforming them into gyms, into a form of palestra, of gyms, where certain capacities will be exercised and practiced that allow us to better connect the symbolic order, the real, whatever that might mean to all of us, and the imaginary. This space, this gym, will be a place of where experience of time in a time of acceleration will probably slow down to apparent stillness in some cases, and therefore a rather obsolete condition where aesthetics awaits the public, does not need to do anything necessarily, or not necessarily. So I'm going to think about ways in which we can go beyond a binary vision of basically what I see as a return to a very binary vision, very Cartesian vision of a dichotomy between the mind and the body, a very old idea, and therefore a dichotomy between the real and the virtual. So basically, there are two conclusions. For those of you who don't want to stay for the next hour and listen to all of this, there are basically two conclusions and 2 points that I'd like to make. The first is that what I try to describe is that I see the future of museums as a yoga center, let's say, where we'll be able to exercise certain atrophied capacities due to the excess of the digital. This is normal. It's totally normal. Whenever a new technology comes in, like for example, watches and clocks, people forget other capacities that become atrophied, like being able to tell what time of day it is by looking at the sun and so forth. So that is the first conclusion, which is how to create this correlation between the body and the body space, the body in space, the perception of objects that are only partly visible and partly seen in your peripheric vision in so-called physical space, and then the experience of these other ontologically different objects, which are the digital proposed by our screens and through our screens. So how to find a new 21st century form of peripatetic knowledge, of peripatetic philosophy, let's say, in the old Greek way that tried to align thinking with walking. The second conclusion is that counter to all indications by everyone who's in industry and in the so-called world of progress, I probably feel that the older notion of participation, that art is good if it's participated, if we participate in it, if we pay attention and we are therefore constructing the artwork together with artists, will probably give way to a new exploration of passivity and lack of attention, a space where it's possible to not feel obliged to participate. So digital screens, in fact, they're said to unite us, but they also separate bodies. Now, what I'm going to do is share my screen, and I hope my screen can be shared. Okay. So now, here I am. So here, well, actually, here I am not, and here you are not. Here is the Castello di Rivoli, and outside in front of the Castello di Rivoli is a Giuseppe Pennone work in bronze, which is what you see an image of on your screen of a bronze cast of a tree, a kind of ur tree, covered on the top of it with the same cast of a tree, but in aluminium. And in between the branches, you have mirrors that are caught. And we're going to get to the question of screens and mirrors shortly. But I thought that might be an emblematic start to discussing this matter at hand. So digital screens are said to unite us, but they're also separate people's embodied experiences of one another. And they limit, the main thing that they do is limit the random encounters of the body. Okay, the random encounters of bodies that occur out of the bubble, out of the digital bubbles that we create, and which were typical of previous meetings in museums, encounters in museums. I know a person who would go to museums to find a girlfriend or a boyfriend or a partner, and because they felt that those random encounters in museums were highly positive in the results. So this is the old museum. This is, you see visitors crowding closely together in front of Las Meninas in Prado. And of course, we're talking about another work of art that has to do with looking and seeing and the gaze of ourselves and the gaze of the other and the question of the mirror, let's say. So this obsolete museum has given way to this, or is giving way to this. Now this is the Castello di Rivoli, and it's a visitor during the one single day in which we were able to open between November 4th and November 5th and of last year, of 2020, after our first lockdown, which was up until May 19th. And he's experiencing with VR glasses, Jordan Wolfson's piece called Real Violence of the 2017. And he's wearing a mask because we are in the middle of COVID. So his mouth is masked, the locus of speech, and his eyes are masked. He's unable to see who is around him and what's going on around him, totally immersed into the screen. Now, anti-COVID masks. So while digital screens, I said, are said to unite, but they also separate people's embodied experiences of one another, anti-COVID masks, on the other hand, are said to separate us from contracting or spreading the virus. But they also unite us in a common cause to reduce disease and death, as well as to bring what they do is bring art and its goals closer to the care of the body. So oddly enough, the culture of the mask is also dual in its nature and reminds us of how masks are also devices that bring the care of the body and the care of knowledge. I don't say of the mind, I say of knowledge, closer together. So surely these are some masks that are in the Castello di Rivoli right now. This is a Negil mask from the Fang community in Gabon. It's pre-1930, and although it was interpreted as a mask of serenity, it actually is a very scary mask, more worn by the, let's call them the police, doing rounds at night because of the connotations of the white and the form, so a terrifying mask. So masks were always used both to protect and to transform us metamorphically in cultures from antiquity to the contemporary. This is a very contemporary mask made by Bodic, a indigenous artist from the west coast of Vancouver. Other masks made by Bodic are, as you can obviously see, post-screen-based digital period, because they blend and mix in a collage way, in a syncretic way, masks from all periods and parts of the world. Here we have a typical landscape of our COVID days, and people wearing masks, and the masks that separate and unite, and masks and the creativity around creating masks. Castello di Rivoli masks, and Anne Imhoff wearing her mask. Where is the link to the, not yet. Okay, so Anne Imhoff in her exhibition currently on at the museum wearing her mask, and behind her another mask, which is the artwork, let's say, drawings of ghosts that were once in the space of the museum when she did her performances, because her work, her material right now is illegal. Her material is aggregation of bodies where you do not see the distinction between the visitors and audience of the performance and the performers themselves. So they're present as masked and blindfolded, or perhaps wearing digital glasses, digital goggles, virtual reality goggles. They're present in the exhibition as drawings here and there and as ghosts in an exhibition that has no visitors at present. Now the question of masks and screens, because basically I'm kind of arguing that masks are screens and screens are masks, depending on how we see them, was explored through an earlier exhibition by Hito Sterl, where she masked the windows of the Manicalunga with faux windows that were painted and actually obscured the entire third floor of the Manicalunga building, where on one end of the gallery was a screen, a large flat screen on an easel, therefore speaking about the obsolescence, let's say, of painting on an easel and the topicality, let's say, of media-based works now in the museum. But what was on the screen were tests, was a film, a kind of documentary artistic film created in a lab, which is a huge hangar in the UK, where artificial intelligence programs are being tested in order to teach the AI to recognize intruders and sell a software that will protect people's homes from robbers and intruders into the home. And on the opposite end of the entirely void and empty space, so basically Hito Sterl somehow anticipated the evacuation of the physical public from the museum, which we now have experienced throughout 2020, she somehow anticipated it as a consequence of a screen-based society, and decided to create this extraordinarily empty long gallery with the overload of verbal presence on the walls, and at the back of the gallery, another screen, a window onto the world. As you know, paintings were considered windows onto the world, that had to do with community-based work in underprivileged communities in Chicago and in Detroit and in other parts of the United States, where painters are working as house painters, having become obsolete. They're working as house painters, painting faux windows on abandoned real estate that has been boarded up. So in the contrast between this two extremes, we had broken windows smashed by the artist in the gallery spaces, and reflecting on this society of broken windows and quietly on the broken window theory in economy. So here is our screen-based world. We're in a world where people are masked and are looking at other parts of the world through their screens. Just 1 second, I wanted to just skip, since I'm in a kind of a university environment. So the cell phone, of course, is a particular kind of screen, and it is a transition perhaps between an era of screens that were not prosthetic to the body to an era where the digital screen is embedded within our own brains or under our skin or whatever. So obviously we're talking about things that Beatrice Colomina and Mark Wigley wrote about quite a lot in their book. Their book of 2016 called Homo Cellularis, Are We Human? And they comment on how before the 1960s, there was some sort of a sense of privacy, which collapsed slowly since the 1960s with the satellite imagery, of course, and the birth of l'era dello specchio, the era of the mirror, where we see our planet from the outside, almost like as if we were God. And this, of course, is pinpointed with the first images from the moon of Earth in 1969, for example. So throughout this second half of the 20th century and early 21st, privacy in traditional spaces and the degree, one arrives at the degree of online exposure today that we see in the Zoom talks, where the interior of people's homes are themselves being constructed. There's architects working on constructing design for homes that will look good in Zoom meetings. So the cell phone, of course, is a little bit older. I mean, it was started, the research in 1980s, but it was distributed around 1990 and then integrated with the computer into the smartphone with iPhones in 2007. So that is, of course, brings us to today, where there are many more cell phones than people in the world. And there are more cell phones in the world than toilets. It's rare to find a human on the planet without the device. So the time at the computer or phones is, people check their phones more than 100 times a day, way more than 100 times a day, relieving boredom, which has something to do with the problem of narcissism that we'll get back to after speaking about the mirror, and the avoiding of communication with people that are in the vicinity, like we see in this slide or in this slide, of course. And so they're both connecting devices and disconnecting devices. And to the degree that Daniel Wegner coined the term nomophobia, where Google is really changing our brains and so forth. And we have a fear of losing the cell phone and certain anxiety of not being without our processes for memory. So the internet has been integrated into our cognitive tools, and perhaps more important than water or food for many people, as we can see how refugees deal with the cell phones. So we live in this hybrid space where the virtual and the real are actually in a form of continuity through a concept of plasticity and metamorphosis. And this, of course, is very close to the idea of what goes on in this video, which I'm going to share with you for a few moments. Now, we don't really need to spend too much time on this, but I think the point can be clearly made. So, riprendi. So this is a very long, complicated thing to know for the next videos. So that brings us basically to the question of Narcissus and the child in looking at himself in a mirror. But before getting to that, I remind you that the mask, the word mask or maschera, is born in the 1500s as something that creates a false face to hide or guard something. And it comes probably from Arabic mascara, from which comes the mascara for our eyebrows, as someone who is a buffoon and mocking another person. So while screen also is both something that we put in our homes to hide a certain area, to screen off a certain area, to be a barrier. So it is not only, it is itself also a mascara in the sense of its reference prior to, let's say, the magic lantern and the use of the word within as a projection of images space, which was actually quite recent. So our little boy here, is somehow in identifying his own image in the mirror, and that would be what Lacan in his 1949 essay called the mirror stage. Now, the mirror stage is the first time that you understand yourself as being a self and not an omnipotent, let's say, fully connected being with the mother and with food and so forth. And the mirror stage is, of course, extremely important to the identification of a subject as a subject, but it has never been something that has been a place where one remains forever. It's a short transition when the child is around 2 years old. But in this painting by Caravaggio from the late 1500s, we have Caravaggio looking into the water and seeing in the murky brown water an image of himself. Now, what Caravaggio is painting is not a young man seeing a beautiful image of himself, but it's a young man seeing actually his own death, so predicting his own death. And when one remains in a narcissistic disorder, often there are aggressive impulses which emerge. And in some ways, in recent interpretations of Freud's theory of narcissism, narcissism is not only an impulse to self-protect, to protect ourselves, but insofar as it avoids the connection with others, the libidinal impulse put into the subject himself or herself gazing onto the world means also the avoidance of food or even procreation, and therefore quite close to certain forms of disturbances that can occur due to an excess of screen-based activities. So in some ways, Caravaggio was also saying that the narcissism could be reversed. Now, this is a reversal of the painting made by Silvia Carderoni, sent to me in an email, the artist and actor, incredible performer, Italian performer. And what she did by reversing the painting was quite extraordinary, because it underlies how much of a death drive is also within this narcissistic impulse. So that made me think about Michelangelo Pistoletto's Metro Cubo di Infinito from 1966, which is simply a cube where the mirror is positioned on the inside of the cube. Therefore, in a way, it is speaking about the foreclosure of the knowledge of the image of the reflection. So somehow the screen is always foreclosed to us in a way that also I could say, you could say that Lacan indicates the impossibility in his later work of the 50s, when he proposes the orders of the symbolic, the real, and the imaginary. He speaks, of course, of our inability and impossibility, of the resistance, let's say, of the unknowable real, which we can only access through the imaginary constructions that we build and create about that reality via the symbolic, which is language, and which therefore, whatever language that may be, the order of the father, the language of verbal language, or of images, or of an exhibition, or of a neuroscientist paper, or whatever. So this foreclosure of the image fundamentally to anyone was then reversed. And what I find very symptomatic was when the cube was shown and exhibited in Beijing, I believe in the Gallery Continua very recently, just a few years ago, I'm sure with the consensus of Michelangelo Pistoletto, the gallery, or Pistoletto, decided to exhibit it within a space of reflection of mirrors, in a way, renewing the piece and underlying how we have arrived at this stage as somehow being stuck within this infinite reflection of this infinite mirror stage that we find ourselves in. Now, just yesterday, I was watching the new collection, Aria, that Gucci, of course, sent through the internet, not being able to aggregate in fashion shows. Now, fashion, of course, is something fundamentally related to our bodies, because it is both an imaginary recreation of ourselves in a metamorphic fashion, very close to what an imaginary construction is, and at the same time you can't really not wear it unless you build somehow on this imaginary self. So what I found very intriguing in the video that Alessandro Michele created for the fashion show of yesterday to launch the new season, I guess the fall season, was this environment of the myriad cameras, of film cameras, photographic cameras that were clicking, 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 clicking without the public being the audience, who normally would be at a fashion show, personified by the devices, the technological devices that would be filming the whole event. And in this case, what was intriguing was how the lights, which you cannot see because I'm giving you a still frame, but what was interesting is that the lights of the cameras that were being filmed, as they were going off, were creating a vibration, a kind of bodily vibration, an artwork in a way, that was activating the body to the degree that there had to be a disclaimer for people who suffer from epilepsy. Sorry, the word was missing to me for a second. So this is a case where a screen-based work somehow pushes out into the physical space of those who are sitting down at the laptop or computer or their cell phones, disturbing certain elements going on in our brains to somehow create this continuous space of plasticity that we were talking about. Now, another thing that I've spent time looking at over the last weeks are the posts that a digital artist who is has not exhibited or worked in the art world or in museums posts every day on his Instagram and Twitter. And clearly the seriality of posting these images that are made only with digital technology, digital software on the laptop, nothing off the laptop, and that are then vehicled within the art world. And you may be aware of this sale, incredible sale that Christie's made of these, of the collection of all 5,000 of these images made by the artist Beeple, collaged into one sort of large collage. But actually what was sold is a certificate of property, because the actual images in their highest resolution form are open source, and they're given out into the world of the digital public. Now, what is this digital public? Does the image exist on its own without the 500 or 600 comments that are posted after he posts his images online by midnight of his time in the United States? I'm not sure at all. And they are, as you can see, stylistically very different one from the other and surprising. But I mean, where the artwork lies and how we deal with this digital audience, which actually in its incredible mirroring of the action of this image maker, give reality to the images in a way, confer reality in what Leonardo Caffo would say is a lack of distance between, or the lack of differentiation between audience and image. And this lack of differentiation, lack of distance, is what brings to psychosis in people who are stuck in the mirror stage. And that is the death that occurs when Narcissus falls into the water and dies. So the inability to maintain what psychoanalyst Recalcati, following Lacanian theory, would say, to maintain that distance between us, whoever us is, and the screen. Now this is again, I take you back to an image of the museum before, the old museum. This is prior to cell phones. It's a photograph by Thomas Struth. And what you notice mainly is that they're not looking at the paintings. They're actually not. So what was the museum? It was a place where there was no obligation to push a button or activate a file or open an email or send a comment or do what I'm doing now to pass from one image to another on my PowerPoint. And most of the people are not looking at the artwork. They're just there. Maybe the man on the left is, but they're looking at other people. They're simply like in a park. And it's very interesting that in museums in the 1800s, there were benches typically looking like benches from parks. So this is, of course, you could say they're screens, these pictures onto the world, but they are objects ontologically of a quite different order that exists in our peripheral gaze and bring forms of knowledge through peripheral disattenzione. And I want to spend 2 minutes showing you a work that Susan Phillips, the artist, created using the music, her a cappella singing of a piece by the Rolling Stones, As Tears Go By, in 1998. Her work is often about melancholy and solitude in this a cappella voice, singing very famous songs in particular spaces. And this she presented in many different locations, including the Fondation Bailert, in the entrance lobby where a beautiful Monet is hanging. And the version that you will see is an artwork made for the digital platform itself of our museum, the Cosmo Digitale. So it is not documentation of an artwork, it is not the translation of an exhibition into the digital space or how the work will be, pointed at. It's not like an NFT pointing to a digital artwork. It actually is made for the experience of someone sitting down. And you will notice that in the background of her voice, you hear hushing rumors. So she very carefully layered certain ghosts in the way that Anne Imhoff layered certain ghosts of her drawings of figures in the Manica Lunga. So this is a COVID pandemic time work, 2 minutes, made for us. Okay, so we're back into the PowerPoint. And one of the artists who has worked quite early on in trying to understand digital subjectivity, or the subjectivity in the digital age, an age of screen-based work and play, is Ed Atkins. And this is an iconic still frame. Everything he makes is done online. I mean, he's actually painting, I have to tell you, he's painting now, which is tells you all. But for quite a long time, he was using CGI, computer graphic bot skin and so forth, exaggerating to create these bodies that are artificial. And in the eyes, you see somehow embedded here 2 screens. Now, the reason I would like to bring up Ed Atkins is because when I spoke to you about the Museum of the Future in being a form of practice or exercise, peripatetic exercise in knowledge, joining both aspects of our perception coming through screens and through the environment that we're standing in, he created a number of exhibitions such as this one, that, well, this is not the exhibition, this is a still image of the environment in the Castello di Rivoli, where you see on the 3rd floor, you can see the beams, the wooden beams of the ceiling, large, very large screens on walls, basically walls that we built in the space, where this melancholy subject, this melancholy narcissistic subject, never satisfied by the number of likes, never satisfied, and drunk and smoking a cigarette, is projected multiple times. This is an artwork that you cannot project as a single channel screen, on a single channel screen. It must be repeated. And this has much to do with the question of periodicity, why Netflix series are so popular, why Star Trek series influence so much of the digital computer graphic artists who are working now, and what it means to somehow ground subjectivity within an order, within a number of rules of repetition, rules of interval, rules of time, to avoid forms of a neurotic disorder, let's say, and to ground the self. And therefore, somehow, in order to live in a world that is so expansive and that is so full of data, big data, very simple rules are very useful. And one of them is repetition and distance, and counting time, counting intervals of time. And the fact of being in the physical spaces of the museum was carefully orchestrated by him so that viewers' images of the outside world, for example, through this round kind of science fiction oblong down at the end of the corridor, and the image of the finger in the eye connect. The metamorphic subjects that we are becoming constantly. Now, another artist who's really working closely with us is Agnieska Kurant, and these are very particular paintings that actually move. So you can Google her work and see videos of this. This is actually the same painting that I'm showing you in 2 different moments. It's basically thermally reactive material with copper and thermally reactive paint that creates a kind of a liquid crystal painting that transforms according to a sentiment analysis of what's going on social media accounts during protests. So protests in any kind of protest in any country in the world. She's worked with technicians to develop algorithms that analyze the sentiment that people have during their participation in protest movements. Why protest movements? Because joy, anger, and so forth become extremely visible, and therefore can turn into different colors and different patterns. It basically creates a kind of evolving collective thermal footprint. And she refers in her work to the fact that social energies are constantly mined and monetized, just like oil and gas used to be, and in our attention economy. And so she changes in a way which is typical of artists, the AI program to harvesting instead social energy of enthusiasm, joy, fear, and so forth from thousands of people around the world. So it's a kind of collectively authored painting, however, not collective in the sense that the program and the concept is hers, but the images that you see are connected to computational results from real life data input. So it is a kind of analysis of collective intelligence. And the image also evolves and oscillates, and this is intentional, to resembling on also things like bacterial colonies and slime molds, or sometimes maps, geologies, and galaxies. So we will be seeing her work very soon at the Castello di Rivoli in the fall. But I do think that it is an example of how we will be dealing, I mean, how museums will be confronting, in this case, a kind of critical consciousness needed and understanding of the screen-based world we're living in. This is only here just for a moment as a kind of diversivo, kind of fun moment, because she also pays homage to Fordist economies. These are called post-Fordites, and they're simply made with leftover paint layers from Ford factories of cars. So this is basically what's left of the industrial era in our times, according to Agnieska. Now, masks have been connected to the problem of being alive and of health. And on the one hand, we couldn't breathe because we are sick with COVID. On the other hand, people couldn't breathe because of oppression and police violence. And this connection between breathing in 2012 was astonishing to me, and was one of perhaps the reasons why one of the other ways that museums can move in the future is to correlate the question of personal physical health and mental and spiritual well-being. So the question of curare and the ambivalence between to curate, which means, which has many connotations. It means to take care of, to heal, curare, a doctor, cura, but it also is to curate an exhibition. So it moved us towards offering our museum, and in particular the spaces that Claudia Conte had painted with her wall paintings, which you also see behind me when I'm speaking to you in this Zoom meeting, as a vaccination center against COVID-19. The idea also came from, sadly, the fact that our chairman, Fiorenzo Alfieri, died of COVID in December of 2020. So our vaccination center, which is a collaboration with, the health authorities of the Regione Piemonte, it will open and start on the 29th of this month of April. And I'm going to connect you to a soundtrack because I would like you to understand that the way that this can work is actually not just hosting places, but making art with artists that are working collaboratively with scientists, doctors, and many others. And in this case, Claudia Conte made a new work called The Pattern Connects, which is a sound piece. She worked together with a musician, composer, Elliot, friend of hers. And I'm going to try to connect just for a moment, because I think I've spoken. Well, I don't believe that you heard a portion of her soundtrack, sadly, because I'm not a digital native. But what I'd like to say is that it was a soundtrack designed as an artwork for the whole process of the vaccination. I'm going to play it through my phone. And I'm going to move forward a little bit in that sound. Basically, it's a 41-minute parcours because people will go through different emotions, emotions of fear, emotions of practicity, emotions of relief, and so on. So I'm going to now move forward in the sound to another moment, but basically move on to the next. And so forth. So it mixes a certain typical typology of sounds that we connect with relaxing sounds of nature and so forth. So there are examples of artworks that were connected with healing and well-being. Sanatorium was basically a clinic. In the documenta that Vittorio Gallese mentioned, that I organized in 2012, where Pedro Reyes basically created an actual mental health clinic or spiritual health clinic, where objects and sculptures were used as in a Melanie Kleinian way to deal with different questions according to what questions the different visitors of the exhibition had. Threeing was a actual yoga center connected to the concept of threeing, as opposed to seeing things in a binary way between action and reaction. We can also choose the third position, which is do nothing. And so taking on and switching positions as a kind of conflict resolution therapy was an important artwork and an important prehistory to what I think will be going on in some museums in the upcoming future. Another example was Marcus Lutyens, who hypnotized, who's an artist and a hypnotist, and hypnotized 17,000 people during the Documenta in this small shed in the gardens, and has hypnotized audiences all over the world in museums. Here are two hypnotized visitors. It's interesting because they are visitors with eyes closed. So another kind of a screen, an inner screen that has to do with the voice. And I would have transmitted for you for one moment, but I believe the sound will not work. Let's try. His hypnotic session done during COVID pandemic times.
Presentation by Marcus.
As you looking at the screen, perhaps you can see a seat in the middle of the screen. Perhaps it's on a stage. And perhaps there's a white background behind it. The wooden floor, the gray cushions. And perhaps you can see the shadow of light on the white screen and how it's divided into two areas. There's the lighter area on the right, and then a more shaded area on the left. And perhaps you could imagine the image of a perfect black circle that can mean multiple things. This emoji can mean a total eclipse. It can mean a blackout. It can mean the pause button on music. Perhaps it's an entry point or a lost thought, or the gap between imaginary ideas. And I'd like you now just to focus all your attention on that dot in the middle of the screen with the chair underneath it, on the stage and the red curtains, the red chairs, the conference room.
Okay, so that was another example of an artwork made, let's say, to deal with screen-based experience and somehow push into the space of the seated person. It's a very interesting thing that digital world, the selfie world, the world of the selfie, of the Lacanian mirror constantly looking back at us or us looking back at ourselves. It's very interesting that workers, cognitive workers of our time, what Beeple and others would consider the people with the actual agency on a social level, are described being very good at what they do as sitting down and committing. You know, they say, sit down and work. Whereas in the past, we used to say, you know, get up and work, stop sitting down. So that tells us all about how our world has changed. The next slide. Okay, the next and last slide, the last thing I'd like to speak to you about, which is another example of how museums are dealing with screen-based society and what we call a kind of exercise in coordinating screen-based experience and bodily experiences, not sitting down. Not sitting down is Henri Sala's installation, which in the same spaces where Ed Atkins' exhibition was, created using Pandora software, a virtual reality model of the space where he moved the films that were being played, his own films, he moved them on a loop around the space. So we were not watching a loop on a film sitting still, but we were walking around the space as following the film. The films, there were several of his films on the screens that were passing by you. And if you wanted to be in sync with it, you had to actually walk peripatetically while watching. And I think that I would like to end talking about this Sala piece and returning to the original idea of the inaccessibility of the real. I mean, there isn't a real world and a real world, an analog world, and then a digital world, because the so-called digital world is part of the real world, and the real world was never accessible, if not as a mere shadow of itself in our imaginary constructions. But we are kind of like snails and old men. Old men may be playing a violin with a snail on it. And I think that we're somehow trying to find a missing point, which is never brought up in these conferences, I think. We're trying to find, as an old species, an accord with a new instrument, our violin of today, how to play it and how to be safe with the rest of the environment, with the other species on the planet, how to be safe in multi-species coevolution while learning to play these new instruments. But too much of our thinking around this subject is always anthropocentric, because it deals with intelligence of the digital and intelligence of the human, somehow comparing or thinking of how to map and unite these different intelligences through the artificial. But the real issue is actually another one. It's how to interact and how to co-evolve on life and with life, not just on life, which is the term used to speak about this continuous plasticity within our lives today, but with life. And in this, I remind us that a psychoanalyst and artist, Bracha Ettinger, in her matrixual theory, which was very important to me in the early 90s, because she questioned the binary thinking of patriarchal society, where there would be the before birth and the after birth, for example, and this in praise of the transitional and in praise of the process of change, of constant change in a kind of post-Bergsonian mode. Her thesis then was not actually only one of saying there isn't black and white, there isn't online and offline, there isn't screen and not screen. It was also to say that there is another in this duo, Sheila and Caridis, in this duo that need to be avoided and eschewed. There's actually another peril, which is the peril of ideologizing as something necessarily positive and always positive for our well-being, the sense of continuous plasticity and metamorphosis. So the emergence of a theory of constant metamorphosis as the focus of well-being actually somehow collapsed into this constant plasticity asked of us in the digital age. And after all, our goal, so to go back to this attempt to reconnect the missing element in all of this, and to leave Bracha's ideas now behind and go back to my own thinking, our goal is not only to survive on the planet, but to flourish on this planet of ours. And until we do not integrate our thinking about the digital with our thinking about the ecological balance between prey, predator, and parasites, we will get nowhere. And let's think about the relationship between this man in the last video that I'm going to show you an excerpt from, and the snail, a very, very ancient species that appeared 150 million years ago in the Cretaceous period, and how his needing to play Stravinsky very badly, or to play Stravinsky very slowly, to play this new instrument that he could play very well, very quickly, but let's play it in a way that the snail and I and Stravinsky and the violin will all play together. And so I'm going to now end showing you, sharing with you a little excerpt from one of the films that was moving away from you and in the Henri Sala exhibition, and that you had to follow and move together with. So I'm going to now share this and then end my presentation on this point. Well, that's about it.
Sorry, I'm waiting to be able to share my video. Apparently, can you hear me?
Yes, of course. Yes.
I really like this performative somehow quality of this final webinar. Thank you so much, Carolyn, for this incredible tour. You said many stimulating and really thought-provoking things. So while our friends are heating up to ask questions, I use my privilege of chair to start. I kind of noticed this time once more a kind of ambivalent attitude of yours towards the digital, which I should add, totally share. So in your presentation, you beautifully synthesized the many dimensions of the screen. So on the one hand, by alternating between the before and now vision of what the experience of a museum can be, by means of this contrast, I think you wanted to emphasize the meeting place, the social dimension of the museum that is now totally absent. But on the other hand, I think you testified with your work, with the work of the institution you're directing, Castello di Rivoli, how the digital can reconfigure a space that now, because of the vaccine, will be filled with people, although distanced, and adds to the social experience of the place and of the practice these people are involved with. So do we need to find a balance between the two, or how do you see the next 10 years once we'll be out of this global sanitary emergency?
Yeah.
How do you see the future? There will be more soundscapes or there will be more passivity? So the museum as an oasis to reconfigure our bodily practices when relating to creativity or the political statement about it.
Well, that's a very good question. When you notice my ambivalence, it is not because I don't want to choose sides. It is because I think it's useless to choose sides. I mean, we are in a digital epistemic regime. I mean, or how do you say? Our lives are. I mean, it's an old question to pick. You know, to think that we can pick. So that is not. I'm certainly not a Luddite, and I'm certainly not uninterested in this. What happens? I mean, what I'm interested in is how we can explore how subjectivity is constructed within a period, within a world where we are at keyboard and away from keyboard. I'm not interested in the question of digital or non-digital. Digital are certain tools. They're tools that artists have used for the last 50 years. I mean, since Namjoon Paik, in a way. I mean, so there's nothing new to using digital software to make artworks. I mean, that is normal in our world. But what is needing, I mean, I do notice that we are returning to a kind of binary mode where the body is either sitting at keyboard or away from keyboard. And the only place where that doesn't happen is when one is, you know, walking in the street with the cell phone or driving with the cell phone. Now that usually causes accidents. People fall and break their leg, or they have a car accident or something. So I think that the problem is a health problem, you know, a problem of the body needing to exercise, the body needing to have oxygen, needing to breathe, needing to walk, the muscles. And therefore there's an issue of simply going to the gym. I mean, that's really a big issue in the 21st century, I think. That's why I speak about art and well-being and museums as a potential area where this can happen without taking us away from the digital. I mean, museums are constantly experienced through the digital as well, inside the museum. I mean, when you watch us in a historical museum, when you watch a screen that tells you how Vittorio Amedeo II was having dinner, in that gallery, you're watching something digital inside the space where you maybe will see his original furniture. I mean, I see that happening in the future of museums of history. I don't see that happening in museums of contemporary art because artists won't allow it, because the digital media is a medium. It's a medium, like painting, sculpture, installation. So they won't allow an education department to overbear their work with a digital layer of mediation. But all the historical museums or museums of science and so forth will have this whole infrastructure in it. So I don't see a division, but I am quite interested in podcasts right now, and a lot, which is somehow retreating, you know, retreating from the 3D virtual world or the augmented reality world. Because the podcast, like an old radio program, allows for walking and listening in the park and so forth. So we are producing new podcasts, and And many institutions that have to do with contemporary art are doing a lot of that, rather than doing a lot of public Zoom conferences. Everybody was doing live Instagram 6 months ago. We've been Instagrammed out, we've been Zoomed out, and so I think now there's a more sophisticated look at what are the ways that this correlation. That's why I keep using peripatetic knowledge, can occur. So I think that is how we will be going. But museums, the thing that you said, I think you added something that's very important. The question of passivity is very important. I mean, in the ideology of today, passivity has no place.
No.
I mean, it has no place.
By all means.
There's nowhere that says that we should be passive, nowhere. I mean, it's considered politically incorrect, because we're not giving access through participation. It's considered technologically obsolete. It's considered just like being lazy. It's like saying you're lazy. You want to be lazy and do nothing. But Pierre Huyghe used to speak of the no knowledge zones, of these zones of no knowledge. And, where is the space in our society for sleeping? We are sleeping very little. And as you who are a neuroscientist know, sleep is super important. Certain things get reconfigured. And the fact of not having that passive, no agency moments, which are interestingly present in the obsolete museums, the oldest museums, the pleasure of going into a old-fashioned museum and just, what a relief, is because it creates a possibility for the brain to have some downtime and for the body to have some leisure time, which is not the same as the body going into the gym and exercising. That's active, that's not passive.
Right. I'm looking if someone in the audience would like to ask questions. If not, let me continue by adding this. By the way, I was part.
I'm okay with them they're not forced to have questions. If
no, of course.
That's fine. They can
Of course they are not. Since I was part of the marathon you organized a few months ago, digital PTSD, and I wasn't able to get hypnotized because probably I had taken too much during the whole day. I was too much activated. My reticular system was firing like hell. But coming back to the point of passivity you were talking about, all you said is right. I mean, today, speaking of passivity is speaking of something you should challenge, that you should fight, because everything has to be performing, which is not performative. Performative is a different thing. And so what a better example of the performativity of an apparent passivity. As you were talking, I was thinking about the spiritual exercises of Sant'Ignazio, which is an exercise of embodiment in a situation of total passive meditation, which nevertheless activate a lot of stuff. And another interesting point coming clearly out of your presentation was the prophetic quality.
The what?
The prophetic quality of many of the artworks that you showed us. So perhaps, although it may sound as a shortcut, wouldn't it be possible that it's just through the artist, through art, that we will be able to explore new metamorphic aspects of the digital that we non-artist chaps are not able to foresee?
Of course. I mean, I am una vestale dell'arte. I spend my time with artists, but all, you know, all major curators do that. The bad ones spend time with funders, and the good ones spend time with artists. It's not only artists, I mean, artists primarily for us, but I mean that in an extensive way. I mean, if you deal with poetry, it's poets and so forth. But I do think that both in history and in the present, in all cultures of the world, the makers of images and the makers of what we call cultural artifacts have always been not only a reflection of the society that they lived in, but also testing the tools that they had and testing them in a prototypical way, prototypes, and therefore understanding issues, problems. It's not just Leonardo da Vinci who was prophetic, you know, and testing and trying out all these different things. But I think probably, you know, 40,000 years ago, when you harness fire for the first time, it's not just fire coming from the sky that burns a forest and that you can keep and hold the fire, that it never must be turned off. But when you learn how to make fire, one of the first things that they probably did was the cave paintings. So you have this new tool and you're exercising the new tool and you're representing for the first time images of what you're normally doing, of your engagement with the planet. This is a prophetic mode. I mean, they have always been prophetic, but I'm not idealizing only human artists. I mean, I think you're skipping my last point, which is the most problematic one, you know, which is that the artistic field is very anthropocentric because art is considered one of the primary things that humans do, or essential things. A neuroscientist generally, aside from studying the brain of chimpanzees and things, using other species for their tests, but generally it's always keyed towards somehow understanding our brains and then how to simulate them with artificial brains. But it's a very anthropocentric field. And I think that this
that's not the only game in town.
No, it's not the only game in town.
I mean, there's a very strong movement towards going beyond the human through artificial intelligence, which doesn't need anymore to be anthropomorphic. Actually, I think
that's interesting. What are you talking about? Tell me. That's very interesting. You mean there's artificial plant intelligence?
Yeah, I mean algorithms that are able to do whatever you ask them to do for you, but you never have a clue how they come to that conclusion much in a quicker way and in a much sharper way than any human.
But you keep saying
that's one application.
Yeah, but you keep saying for you. There's a for you, and you don't know how they do it, but it's for you. You know, machine learning.
Until as many people in the field are actively looking forward to, until when the machine will take over.
Well, I don't really
seriously think that this is the ultimate goal. I met them.
I think that is an anthropocentric goal, because if you look in antiquity, there was the homunculus, and the idea of the robot, the idea of making an alternative human brain, a new artificially, is part of anthropocentric dreams. What I'm trying to say is, when will we connect separate fields, like fields of ecology and ecological studies, with fields of neuroscience, with fields of art, with fields of screen and media studies? I mean, when can I understand the world not only as something that is between people and humans, but somehow connects with this snail. And when are you going to start making the artificial snail brain, or how is the snail brain going to be connected with me so that we co-evolve as cyborgs? I mean, it goes back to Dinah Haraway, but I think that then, and in this, the art, to answer your question, artists have been working on this for now many years. That's why Agnieska Kurant speaks about snail, slime mold, and studies bacteria and so on. So I think that the prophetic nature that we find now in some artists' work is those connections that are not being normally made in working on the digital.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Francesco Casetti. So please open Francesco's mic and camera. Welcome back, Francesco.
Thank you, Carolyn. Hi. Thank you for your lecture and for your work as a curator that I admire quite very much. So I go back to the last question about plasticity and evolution. There is a tons of questions in your that I'm curious of, but maybe in the future or in a personal conversation. But this question of plasticity, it seems to me very, very important, because we are speaking of screen. And I'm a man working, I'm a scholar working on screens since many years. Don't you think that screen is not such a it offers a limited plasticity? And the space of museum is can be much more plastic than the screen. Just a question.
Well, that's a very good question. Thank you very much. It depends on words, the words we use. So how do we define plasticity? I said that Bracha Ettinger, for example, says that we need to avoid both binary thinking, virtual, real, on-screen, off-screen, analog, digital, and the ideologization of plasticity, the ability to metamorphosize and to adapt, which was a kind of ideal in the 60s and 70s and 80s, but that now has become a dominant paradigm, that we are all metamorphosizing, always changing, always plastic. We are free subjects. You can see it in fashion, we've gone back almost to a Greek mythology where we have trees becoming, a woman becoming a tree, becoming another animal. I mean, Ovidio and the metamorphosis of Ovidio. So we are back now in a society where the dominant paradigm is that it is good to be very plastic, to be changing, to be in a constant state of metamorphosis. This is good. To be totally able to change gender, to change shape, form, color, to change our memories, to be hybrid. This is the dominant paradigm of culture now.
For sure.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So I see that as not distinct from the digital age. I mean, of course, there has been a lot of work politically for the rights of minorities, the rights of people who have different sexualities and so forth. So there's been a long, long road to arrive at that point, but I'm not sure one would have arrived at that point without the digital plasticity, because the possibilities of collaging and meme making, the possibilities of constructing and reconstructing and reconfiguring plastically in terms of what goes on the internet is so strong that I think it encouraged this final leap in our societies in terms of the general consensus. I mean, of general consensus. So your question was based on a bias. I mean, all questions are based on biases, all questions, because our knowledge is situated. It's grounded in our own preconceptions and biases. So your question was, don't you think that there's more plasticity in the real world of the museum than in the digital world? But it's how do you say it? C'è una premessa, which is that plasticity would be a good thing. Now, if Catherine Malabou, in her book on destructive plasticity, on how to deal with trauma, I can't remember the name now, but it was a very important book about kind of against Freud, in the sense that Freud said that you elaborate trauma, talking about it and meeting it and going back to the problem. And she said, sometimes people, it's such a trauma, it was 10 years ago, the book, you know, can be so strong that a person just changes life completely, divorces, leaves the country, changes language. You know, Mallarmé goes to Africa and sells wine and changes completely his life and is forgotten by everyone. Yeah, Ontology of the Accident is the name of the book. She sees plasticity as the ability of the brain, as a positive ability of the brain to adapt, for example, to being hybrid, digital and non-digital. But I'm not sure, I think right now, that plasticity is necessarily a positive, I mean, one shouldn't even see it as positive or negative, but I mean, I don't necessarily see it as a liberating condition. It can be, of course, but it depends on how you define the word plasticity. Now, I think, said all that, to answer very briefly, I can't really see the difference between being in the museum. I mean, I can see the difference, but not the distinction. I cannot distinguish between being in the museum physically in front of a painting and being online with a Susan Phillips work. What I do find horrendous is a digital 3D view of the museum where you see the painting as a reproduced image. I think that's so stupid and you know, it's like born obsolete. So it is clear that if you're in front of a Modigliani, the experience of your brain, I don't know if it's plasticity, I don't know, but the possibility of learning and something going on in your brain and in your soul is of course much higher than looking at a Modigliani through the screen, that for sure. I mean, we know that because in the Renaissance, we used the Teatro della Memoria to try to simulate the 3D space, because we all know that memory is very connected to, I mean, Ophelia Deroy does research on that. She did a talk about that. We forget things much more easily if we don't learn them in relation to our moving through space. So lessons of university, you know, online are not as fruitful in the long run as being in a classroom with a university professor. You remember it more because of this spatial movement of the body in space. So if that's what the question was, there's no doubt that to see the painting in the real, it produces a more, you know, let's say plasticity, if that's what plasticity is. But if the question is, do we want more plasticity? I don't know. I don't know, you know, I really don't know. Does that somehow answer your question?
I think in parts, yes. I'm not biased for the desire of plasticity. There is a capital piece by Georg Simmel at the beginning of the 20th century about the contradiction between plasticity and forms, That
That's
is,
interesting. Yeah.
yes, capital point. But in a certain sense, I completely understand. I completely agree with your question. It's two sort of battlegrounds, and let's see where the battle is going, in the real space or in the virtual space of digital.
Well, I can tell you one thing. Speaking, if you know, my mother was an archaeologist, and she always taught me to look at the past to predict the future and understand the future. Obviously, I mean,
I
historians.
completely agree.
Yeah, obviously, historians. And I can tell you that there was a huge boom in technological art in the 1950s and 60s, as we know, and you know, optical art and moving environments, Nicolas Schoeffer and so forth, the Gruppo T, the Gruppo N in Italy. And it was at the time when television was being distributed, and so society was changing, washing machines were being distributed. And so there was a lot of hype around the new technologies. And suddenly the artists just all took their clothes off and went to live in communes in the countryside with no shoes and no bras.
If I may, just as a follow-up about the hot topic of plasticity that you were discussing, from a neurobiological point of view, plasticity is neither positive or negative. It's just a modality of functioning of a certain organismic dynamical system. So you can be plastic in incorporating the fallout effect of a traumatic experience, which literally plastically modify a variety of things, among which your attitude towards your own existence and the world. Similarly, you can be plastic so to learn to play an instrument, to play tennis or soccer or whatever. So that said, I think personally, I don't think it would be too much fruitful to see in a binary way, as you were also saying before, between being present or being digital. But in a way, we had a similar discussion in the last few weeks with another group and with Laura Marcolini of Studio Azzurro and with Pietro Montani. If Pietro Montani were here, who wrote a wonderful piece a couple of days ago on Doppio Zero to defend in praise of didattica a distanza, the digital teaching.
Yeah, teaching, yeah.
And so I think that one could also imagine that when you are visiting a museum from your desktop, I also think that having a 3D visual experience wouldn't add anything, like 3D movies very quickly dropped in their appeal to the public. I mean, I went through it with my kids, and even my kids were telling me, why do we wear this thing? Next time, let's go 2D. What's the big deal? They were 8 or 9. So, but the point is that with the digital, you can have a different acquaintance with the work that your naked eye, you couldn't possibly experience. So I think there is still very little on the digital offer, the digital panorama of the museum. During the first lockdown, one of the things that I did was exploring a variety of digital options all over the world. And I think this way of using the digital medium to make the invisible visible, the invisible through the naked eye, this prosthetic new approach to art, I think also from an epistemic point of view can open new horizons that physical
well, I
presence
think,
cannot,
yeah,
they
I have
shouldn't be.
I have a question. When you're talking about the invisible, do you mean the words that accompany, for example, looking at a painting and the words that
No, I'm
describe
talking
it? Or
about
what
the
do you mean?
painting, about
You
the
mean,
work.
so do you
So,
mean like looking up close at something that?
Close, zooming in, also the trajectory. When we look at a painting, at any image, we explore it by moving our eyes.
Can, yeah.
And the type of scan can be very different according to the purpose of the scan, our mood, the context, the situation. By using the digital enterprise, you can take me through a scanning tour that is decided by the curator. So the curator may, it would be also empirically interesting to see different works seem to suggest to afford a preferential gazing travel, to reveal aspects that the natural way of naive way of scanning couldn't possibly allow. I don't know. I'm thinking aloud, but
yeah. Well, I have nothing against that at all. As you know, I mean, anything that enhances the knowledge and understanding. That's why I keep using the word knowledge, because I'm not sure it's experience in the way that depends on words again. By the way, speaking about words, I incorrectly used a word in answering the question of Francesco, which I would like to make sure has been corrected. I wanted to say something which, I mean, I use the word bias, but I don't actually mean bias, which has a negative connotation. I meant that our knowledge is situated, so we ask a question with a certain premessa. How do you say premessa in English?
premise.
Premise, yeah. There's a kind of,
I don't know.
You take for granted, one takes for granted something which is in the premise to the question.
Assumption,
that's it, assumption. I wanted to use the word assumption. So that's just to put that straight, because it really was a wrong and incorrect word, which I did not use intentionally or appropriately at all. I mean, bias is something very different. I wonder what the etymology is of that. But to go back to your point, I'm not going to say you have a bias for digital close-ups. I'm not going to say that, no. But I think that you as a neuroscientist are very used to a particular mode of knowledge, which is based on the analysis of data coming from experiments, you know, fMRI stuff on the head of somebody. And so you have an image on your laptop of what's going on in the brain, and then you can deduce certain things from that image. So you are allenato, you are exercised in a very particular thing, which is I take the object that I'm studying, the brain, but I don't look at the brain. I don't cut it up anymore. You know, that's what people used to do. I sometimes cut it up, maybe, I don't know. But I'm one of those neuroscientists that takes this imagery and then learns from it. So you have an ability. You have an ability which has brought you to probably in analogous situations. Now, I don't want to psychoanalyze you, but in analogous situations to be more ready and able to deduce certain knowledge from that. There are other people who may not have exercised that ability and who may have a very hard time deciphering, for example, photographs, imagery, filmed images of a material artwork. Oftentimes, there are people that are actually in the arts, you know, people who have a very particularly strong ability to understand touch or have synesthetic, I mean, to speak about synesthesia to you, oh my God, but have particularly synesthetic sensibilities or brains. So they would have a harder time engaging with an artwork through a video, you know, of it, a close-up of it. And then I would like to say that Pietro Montano is surely right in terms of the great advantages that online education is providing around the world. I mean, it provides access. I mean, of course, if there's not a social problem of not having access to the technology, which, as we know, is a big deal. I mean, that's a big problem. But I think that it has really given enormous tools to universities and to schools and so forth. All I was saying before was that, as Ophelia de Roy says, the memory is not necessarily fixed as easily through online education, which is different from what Pietro, you know, the last time I spoke to him about something like this, we were speaking about autistic people and how cell phones, it must have been when cell phones started to be used. And he was saying that cell phones, I mean, integrated with computers, of course, meaning smartphones, has helped a lot of autistic people to communicate more easily because they don't have that fear of that fear.
Yeah,
so
of course.
There are advantages.
That's true, but I think he would go beyond that, and I'm totally with him in that respect. That we should think more creatively on how to accomplish a sort of hybridization. That's a terrible word in English. Hybridization between our standard in-presence way of dealing with education, communication, and what these gadgets have to offer.
Of course, I completely agree.
Let me see if there are any questions left. Apparently not. So I want to thank you so much once more. Really, it was really inspiring, your talk, and you also, among the many things you offered us, there was also a close-up of what's going on as we speak in the art world with the testimony of many great contemporary artists. And I would also since this is the last webinar of the series, I would like to thank all the previous speakers, starting with Mauro Carbone, Ophelia de Roy, Francesco Casetti, Richard Grusin, Manos Tsakiris, Mark Hansen, and you, Carolyn, the Selma staff that helped us to put together this digital open room, and the more than 1,500 people that through the streaming and the recordings of the talks that are uploaded on our YouTube channel had the opportunity to participate in this debate. That my main goal was just to put together different perspectives on these important aspects of contemporary times, trying to deconstruct the digital mediascape, look at it from a variety of perspectives, and this is clearly the beginning of a work in progress. And I hope we will have all other chances to gather, hopefully in presence sooner or later, otherwise through the digital media, to keep on discussing about this fascinating and sometimes also creepy issues. Thank you so much. Thank you for being with us, and see you soon, hopefully.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.